Welcome to the Social Justice War Room, the podcast where we discuss social justice in fiction, reality, and everything in between. My guest today is an old friend of mine from various fandoms who's done a lot of work both in reality and on the internet for leftist activism. He has a blog and prefers to be called by the title he has on the Radical Autism blog, The Radical Writer. Please welcome the Radical Writer. Hello, RW.
Hello, and I guess my first topic is just sort of wondering what is in between like fiction and reality. I assume it's probably where a lot of the right wing seems to exist, going from what they like to tweet about.
That definitely seems to be the case, but your blog definitely covers a lot of things from a neurodiverse lens in the way that like these kind of societal biases and stereotypes do perpetuate themselves through media. Like we're both fans of superhero comics and we discuss that a lot. And in your blog, you have several articles on the ways in which both fascism and neoliberalism are perpetuated through superhero stories.
Yeah, I do. Like you said, I have like we first met like through our mutual interest of superhero comics. We were both on the fan group for The Last Angry Geek, the other channel awesome comic book reviewer that people do not talk about. Sorry, Geek. But yeah, we met through there, and so that's generally been like a topic that we've that's always like binded us together as our friendship formed. And as some like I got into comics myself because of both like The Last Angry Geek and Linkara. Like with Linkara, it was learning about just kind of the general lore and like worlds in superhero comics that made me interested into like getting invested in it. And with The Last Angry Geek, for all the like things one can point out about The Last Angry Geek that he that has kind of held him back as a creator. Like I do always appreciate how he is someone who is actively like saying, hey, here's a comic I read recently, I'll tell you if this is like worth your time reading, which I think does a lot more in getting people like invested in comics than just talking about like bad comics that are like memes in the comic book fandom, like One More Day or whatever. But that's a whole other story. And I guess I would say one thing that's always kind of bugged me, especially as around the same time I was getting into superhero comics, I was also getting like progressively more political and more left wing, was, you always get like the people who are like, oh, superheroes are just like inherently fascist. And I've always rammed up against it. A part of it is just admittedly kind of the vibe of when something you like is being like painted with such a broad brush like that, especially when historically like superheroes being called fascist was literally used for pretense to censor them back in like the 50s. But also just like as I learned more about like what fascism actually is ideologically speaking, I also just felt it's kind of just become one of those examples of people describing using the word fascist to describe anything they find like vaguely authoritarian enough. And I think, and I do not, and again, I've said this on my blog, but I am admittedly very annoyed by the other side of that conversation, which tends to be dedicated superhero fans who are worried about anything problematic about the media they like being sort of like a reflection of their morality, just like automatically like trying to silence down anyone saying anything critical of the genre as just being like a snob who hates comics or something like that. And I think the truth really kind of lies more in the middle, because there are fascistic elements to superheroes. There is like a lot of assumptions about authority and like the rule of law and stuff like that, but it tends to be it tends to be like often a lot more status quo-y. It really depends, admittedly it depends from character to character, and that's also part of the reason why I think the blatant comparison that all superheroes are fascist is kind of a broad brush, because there's a world of political difference between someone like the Punisher and like Kamala Khan. Like those are two very politically very different characters in terms of their views in the world and how they like put those views into practice. But again, it's also just because when you look at enough examples of the genre, that while there are definitely some creators and characters that have very fascistic assumptions, a lot of it tends to be a more of a very liberal genre where it's kind of more based in the virtues of like individual responsibility and kind of like this idea of like good and evil kind of being like inherent traits, and not like the reason why people do bad things like crime having more of like a material reason. And again, there are comics that even like go into the nuances there, but yeah, I feel the general thing to say is that superhero comics, particularly in America, are very much like have kind of like a lot of liberal, some and occasionally like kind of conservative assumptions about the world and society. But of course, the thing about fascism is that there's always like background elements of fascism that exist even in a society that isn't fascist. That's how a fascist movement coalesces. So it's how you get like comic book fans who even though they have all these characters who for years like have always been talking about like diversity, like the X-Men have always been like symbolic of like civil rights struggles, for example, who become very who easily like go into kind of fascistic rhetoric with kind of the way they like celebrate classic with the way they worship this like ideal of like what they thought superhero comics were like when they were like kids and teenagers compared to now, and just how it kind of leads them down to a lot of very authoritarian thinking.
Okay, so that brings us to one thing that we've had so many laughs about, which is a comic you've discussed on your blog, The Champions, written by Mark Waid and drawn by Humberto Ramos, which is, and I won't mince words, saying like the most cringy example of going back to brunch liberalism you can find in superhero comics. And there's a lot of like surface progressivism on it in this very how are you doing, fellow youngsters way, with words like microaggression and punching down being thrown about without any real context behind them. But there's also some elements that kind of point to a much darker hint behind this surface embrace of diversity. Do you want to explain kind of what I'm going for here with this hilariously bad comic and its less hilariously bad ideology?
Yes. I guess obligatory Zizek sniff when talking about ideology there. Yeah. So yeah. Champions is very much Mark Waid's Champions is very much kind of a disappointing comic for me, because literally when I saw like the ads for it, I was like, oh hey, yeah, I love all these characters here, they're all in one book. Like yeah. And I when I was first getting into comics, like one of the series I was really into was Mark Waid's run on Daredevil, which is a very good run, and I'd argue one of the very best. Though that's probably not a very controversial thing to to assert, unless you're one of these comic skaters who's just like so intent on being mad about Mark Waid all the time. Uh, but yeah, it was very much like you said. Actually, the point of comparison I always make is Bob Haney's run on Teen Titans from back in the 60s and early 70s. Like the run of Teen Titans that no one talks about unless you're doing a general retrospective of the team. The before they had like Raven and Cyborg as part of the cast and stuff like that. And it was the epitome of what you would imagine a 1960s comic book starring teen characters written by people who hadn't been teens since the 1930s would be like, which is to say incredibly cringeworthy and like a very like shallow interpretation and like doing stuff that's very like gimmicky, like, oh, let's go to hippie town USA. And Mark Waid's Champions very much has a similar feel to it. It's looking at, oh, hey, the millennials slash zoomers. I always get confused where the cutoff point is with those two generations, even though I'm technically in one of those two camps. But yeah, and it's like, oh yeah, they care like a lot about like social like progressivism and activism, and it leads to like a lot of cringeworthy stuff, like the horrible joke in the second issue where they make a joke about microaggressions with like Viv taking Vision's android daughter taking offense at Miss Marvel like referencing ghost stories because ghosts aren't alive and androids aren't alive, therefore microaggression, which is literal. It sounds like the kind of joke that like a right-wing commentator making fun of this comic for like views on YouTube would make. Like, it's that kind of like understanding of the subject matter. And well, the thing is that and like I really like the Champions as a team. I like the runs that came after Waid was no longer writing the book, but I gave the series a fair chance. I read through the whole thing. There was even like one or two issues that I did like in isolation, but yeah, it was very much both not understanding of the generations. Like, it was more of like from admittedly a writer who was generally supportive of the vague ideas they stood for, but not really understanding or having like a way to really like write these characters in a way where he seemed to understand the generation. And also, just like you were alluding to, just kind of a lot of problematic assumptions that come from the genre. Like, for example, in the very first issue, they address I say with finger quotes child trafficking, and in it it's just basically like, oh yeah, just after the team comes together they just randomly stumble across a plot from like a no-name villain who I think was made just for that issue and hasn't even shown up again since. Although now I'd probably have to wiki that up to
I think he was named Pagliacci, and he was basically like an opera themed ripoff of the Joker.
Yeah, it was like a clown, and like these girls he kidnapped were like in clown makeup, which was very, very inappropriate. Like, I'm not someone who says you can't mix like supervillain crime with this kind of more serious stuff, but like this is like, you have to at least understand tact. Like, there's a reason why like like you never got like sex crimes in like Gotham Central, like, because people realize mixing like that kind of stuff with supervillains, if you don't do it with a deft enough hand, it gets very uncomfortable really fast. And also just because the way it handles it, where it's just like, and we stop this one guy, therefore problem solved, like, even though it doesn't do anything to address why child trafficking happens, which is usually the result of poverty and like exploitation of young people and people who are exploiting young people by saying, hey, you can get rich and famous if you come to this country and I can like pay your way. Like, there's like a whole thing, for example, of a lot of like young Cuban men or like young West African men who are told by like by shady people, oh, hey, you can come over to like America to play baseball, or come over to like Europe to play soccer in FIFA, and like I'll just pay your way and stuff like that, but you have to just give me a down payment. And then next thing they know, they're stuck in a country where they don't know anyone there. And they have no connections, and they have no funds. They have no way of contacting their families back home because some scammer just took all their money. And none of that kind of stuff gets addressed, because this is just something that just comes at the end of the comic, because this is an origin issue and you have to like find some sort of thing to fight just so there's like a climax to it.
Yeah, I'm thinking like how they did that one issue that was clearly with a character based on Malala Yousafzai, where they hear about like theocratic Muslim regime in the Middle East that's preventing women from reading, and of course they go and beat them up with their superpowers, and then everyone's happy at the end and congratulating themselves and not really acknowledging that maybe, as is so often the case in the real life, this regime was propped up by American agencies because it was tactically beneficial for them to have that foothold, and they don't care about the human rights abuses.
Yeah, and also just the fact it was this one village, so it's like there's literally nothing stopping these people from just coming back after you guys leave, like and or even just like with an assumption from that first issue, again, like they hand all these like girls over to the police, which, I mean, like there's a long history of like people who were involved in like child trafficking who got like no help whatsoever from the police, or even actively antagonized by the police when they tried to go for help. And it just goes from like a very problematic assumption in a lot of like superhero comics that just kind of treat like like these cops as the cleanup crew, like they're the people who like come fix up the situation after like Batman or Spider-Man or Superman have done their thing, and like everyone's all bound and gagged, and so now the cops can go and take them to jail. And it's like a problematic assumption because anyone who's just lived through like the past 2 years of history can tell you that like that cops are not neutral actors within the justice system.
Yeah, it's the whole thing just seems like a eerie portent to
This
the
is
way.
something like
Yep.
I don't think I mentioned in the blog, and I don't think I've seen you come up bring up. But
Go on.
one of the last issues that Waid did, this was like towards the very end, where they did like one issue that was sort of like a bunch of different like vignettes of like different champions pairing sort of doing some stuff together, I know like Miles and Nova were out in New York stopping some vaguely Waluigi looking super criminals. But I remember there was also a bit at the Mexican border where they were trying to fight some guys. And the thing is, like, it's sort of like a thing. It's like, oh, we're like protecting like migrants or something like that. But like the threat's not coming from like, border patrol or like these like border militias that like actively try to like harm any like brown people they come across in the desert. It was literally like armed like criminals from Mexico, like cartel men or something like that. And I'm like, Waid, my guy, you do realize this sounds exactly like the sort of shit Trump supporters say is happening at the border all the time, right? You can't possibly see this situation and think, no, there's no way no way that like a right-wing person could read this and say, yes, this is what's happening at the border.
Yeah, this is very much the kind of comic that's after the election of Biden would completely memory hole all the camps of immigrants at the border.
Or the camps of Inhumans, because Secret Empire tie-in.
Oh yeah,
The funny thing is, the champion's actions in like the main Secret Empire title, which I still like defend wholeheartedly as a good like storyline, like their actions in the main like champions in the main Secret Empire book was actually really good, because it was a good side arc with like them them being paired up with Black Widow, and it's sort of like like the cynical older generation that feels like there's nothing left to do to change what's bad in the world, and the youthful optimism but like of people who like are inexperienced and like maybe still have some naivete about the world and like what you need to do to accomplish change. And that was actually like a really good use of the champions in that book, which was even better than like how Waid was generally using them in their own book.
Yeah, so going back a bit, like you definitely wear your neurodivergence on your sleeve in the blog, which is really good, and it helped me come up with this project of mine, actually inspired. But
They're very flattered, by the way.
and it but it does seem like in a lot of leftist circles, the kind of understanding of disability in general, including autism, is either a bit limited or a bit condescending, where it seems like if you bring up things specific to that, it doesn't go over well.
Oh yeah. Like this is actually so. I don't want to say too much here, if only because I have like ideas for blogs later this year that go into detail about some examples. But yeah, like I feel like ableism on the left is like pretty bad. Like I mean, I think like nobody's surprised there's like ableism on the right, because they kind of have a tendency to wear all the other types of isms on their sleeve whenever it's convenient for them. And like even liberals who like are on the right, despite how it might seem from an American political perspective. Uh, they'll still often like condescend or generally act pretty ignorant about like a lot of disability related issues. But like especially on the left, it gets very frustrating, especially like I'm thankful the actual like in real life activists I have worked with are very understanding about neurodivergence and disability. Like they will like ask me questions about things they're uncertain of, and like actually seem to care about these issues. Like none of the actual people I've worked with in real life ever seem to have any issues about like dealing with disability, like from from an ability to like actually like understand and process the information. But online, like it's just it's very much like the result of sort of like the dirtbag left Chapo trap house style, where you just do class reductionism, and you're just kind of like working from the assumption that class is like the only analysis that matters, and taking anything else into account is just like pandering to liberal brainworms or whatever. And like with ableism especially, I feel it's not one that's talked about a lot, probably because there's less like differently abled and neurodivergent creators, just because the way like content creation on the internet works means that if you're somebody who like is more likely to get fatigued or can't like upload on a consistent basis, it's harder to sort of like fight your way to like a reasonably sized platform. But I really do think a lot of it just kind of comes from this blatant like rejection of this idea of like a liberal identity politics, which is definitely disingenuous and doesn't actually address core issues. But like it treats the idea of even bringing this stuff up as giving into it, instead of like acknowledging there's other ways to view these issues, rather than just like uh the most like yeah, the most like disingenuous way. And it's like the difference between pride washing and like queer liberation. The difference between, oh, we put up we change our logo to be like a rainbow for 1 month of the year, but then like we will systemically like deny health benefits to our like gay employees, kind of thing.
Yeah, and
And
it's
yeah,
also
and
personally kind of a paradox to be a socialist, but to have a condition that makes socializing inherently more difficult. How do you?
The thing this is more of like a physical disability than neurodivergence, but I always think of how like Helen Keller, like the woman who was blind and deaf, who like I forget the name of that movie. I think it's called The
A
Miracle
miracle
Worker.
worker? Yeah.
Yeah, like this, like she grew up to be like a socialist activist. She was involved in like the IWW and all that. And I think the best way I've heard her described was by Joe Kasabian of Lions Led by Donkeys, where he said even the blind lady could see capitalism wasn't working.
Yeah. But at the same time, to actually do the work needed to get progress is already hard. And it for things like organizing and making connections, it feels even harder when just being in mixed company feels like a nerve-wracking challenge and you're always second guessing yourself.
Yeah, that's always like an issue, and also just sometimes maybe not being sure if you can like handle certain responsibilities, or like or just being uncertain of like if you're overcommitting because you don't want to feel like a burden, or like you're like not doing enough for the group. That's always kind of a struggle, and especially just it's been a bit of a struggle for me like during the pandemic, just because locked up in a home, you think, oh, okay, well I can do all this stuff to keep me occupied, and then you sort of realize, oh, I really overcommitted, I'm doing way too much stuff at once. uh
Yeah,
but
that's
Yeah, but like going back to the ableism thing, I just want to bring this up because this is always what I think of with like ableism leftist spaces. This was back when, before Peter Coffin successfully burnt every single like bridge of respectability they had with like the broader like leftist community online, to instead hang out with like nosballs. uh I remember there was this thing where I think it was one of those Wojak type comics, one of those like ugly 4chan type comics that just everyone uses now because they got so disseminated. It's the one where, it's like the showing someone who's like a drooling idiot, and like their brain and like their skulls either looks like compacted in, or it's like in the shape of like some random object to sort of like emphasize the fact this is like a stupid person. And there was someone who was like, hey, this isn't really like cool, this is kind of offensive, because you're essentially like showing people who have mental disabilities as being like these like ugly inhuman creatures, and implying that like having a bad political hot take, or having like a very shitty ideology, is the same as having like as having like mental disabilities, and how it's basically pandering into right wing ideas of like IQ equaling superiority kind of thing. And just trying to bring up that basic thing. I mean, obviously it was a tweet, so it wasn't going into all those points explicitly, but it's basically just saying, hey, could we not use this? And like I saw people retweeting Peter Coffin, retweeting that, and saying, it's like, I just don't understand this form of leftist who talks about this and blah blah blah. And I'm looking at that and I'm just thinking, Peter, if you don't know why they think like this, maybe you could ask them for clarification. Or is follow-up questions counter-revolutionary now?
God. It's clearly that social media is where nuance goes to die, and it does
Especially
feel,
Twitter.
yeah, especially Twitter. And you can't seem to have any kind of critique of your own base without being implied that you're somehow selling out your base to the opposition.
Yeah, exactly. And like it's just like really annoying how many times I've seen like lefty people just kind of like get on into like Twitter dunkathons on somebody who brought up an issue relating to like disability, and like they just are like, man, this person's like a liberal, is like a stupid like liberal, like and it's like, this person, like, I mean, this person was making like a legitimate point, like, you can like make fun of it being like a bad tweet without getting into There's one I really want to get into, but it's actually one I'm planning on making like a blog
Oh,
post about.
okay, I'll wait
Yeah,
for
I
that.
don't know. Yeah.
And so, of all the blogs you've done, my favorite so far, which I think also connects to the kind of ways in which different perspectives and neurodiverse perspectives are valuable for uncovering some things that other people might not see it wrong. You did a long thing about how the car, the automobile, is linked to fascism and a lot of the terrible things we're fighting, like how not only the environmental impacts, but also like the kind of toxic individuality promoted by having your own vehicle, the lack of access a lot of people have to cars due to the expense, the ways in which companies have uh, spent so much money to dismantle public infrastructure to keep cars as the main mode of transportation. And of course, the extremists who drive into crowds of protesters. And
Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah,
that,
like
does a lot of that come from like your own issues with transportation, public or private?
oh yeah, like I actually bring this up in the blog myself, and I'm sure someone who's like a bad faith reader of that kind of thing would just take it to assume I'm only have this assumption because I have some sort of like fanatical like hatred of cars, even though like I can also say that like literally one of my favorite games to this day are like the Burnout games, which is basically a video game equivalent of like smashing your Hot Wheels together. But yeah, my relationship to cars is weird because I grew up in rural Ontario, and basically much like rural America, rural Canada is like a very spread out. In fact, it's kind of even more spread out than America, than a lot of America in some places. And basically, if you live in a town that's the size of my hometown, you're basically on a desert island if you can't drive or can't get someone to drive you someplace. There's like no movie theaters. There's like no major grocery stores. It's mainly just like a gas station, like a gas station and like a couple of other businesses. Uh, and that's it. You don't really have too much, and yeah, and so it kind of leaves you being like dependent on having people drive you around. And when you start becoming like when you start reaching adulthood, it starts getting very like annoying when you're become dependent on other people driving you places. And I remember I started feeling when I started living more in Ottawa proper to attend the college classes, and I was just taking the buses to get places. I felt like a lot more liberated, and this isn't me like saying that like the buses in Ottawa are perfect. Like any of the people I do activism work with will like can tell you how like very flawed Ottawa's public transit system is. But it was just very liberating for me for just being like, okay, I don't need to ask anyone in my family or a friend or something to drive me somewhere. I can just look up a bus schedule and I can just ride there. And it wasn't always perfect because sometimes buses are late and sometimes there's weird schedule stuff that that they don't really announce in the travel planner. But it just felt like a lot more freeing to know that like I was getting places because of things that were under my control and not just because of the availability of other people. And it started to sort of make me realize like when I was riding in the car with my family members, just like how many of them were very much like very much short tempered with like people crossing the street, with like people cutting off in traffic, like a very much like a thing where anything that happens is like purely like someone else's fault, and like how dare you inconvenience me, like that very I very kind of like a Karen kind of attitude, that very like middle class, and anything that inconveniences me is like someone else's fault. And it's very much like kind of feels like a lot of the ideology around cars. Like I bring up in the blog about how our current premier Doug Ford, back when he was on Toronto City Council and was basically like unofficially running the city alongside like his mayor, his brother Rob Ford, the crack mayor that was like a meme for like 15 minutes. Uh, basically there was like some legislation that was coming through. The provincial government was like setting up some more like rail lines, like LRT kind of thing, so like subway kind of stuff. And there was also like stuff like putting up toll booths and like reducing the speed limit that were being discussed. And Doug Ford called it a war on the car. And like I even use like their title card here in this title card here in the blog post. But like PragerU put out a video talking about the war on the car, where they use their like general Washington's putting us real Americans under attack rhetoric towards like automobile things, even though I if you literally know anything about like urban planning in the United States, or just the history of cars in the United States, you'll know like there is no one in Washington who's anti-car. Like maybe there's a couple of people who want some more trains or something like that, but like there's about as many people in Washington who are like against car owners as there are people who are like anti-breathing air.
Right. And of course, I just recently showed you a tweet from our old friend Jordan B. Peterson, who is going on about how the attack on the car is an attack on individuality or some shit. And of course, as the self-help guru of the internet right wing, I'm sure a lot of his fans have also driven cars into protesters. So,
well, let me tell you this, socialist. What kind of free nation is it where you can't get your ride pimped by Exhibit himself? Checkmate, atheist.
oh yeah, so closing out, what can we expect to see in terms of new articles from you in the coming months?
Well, currently I'm working on one that has like a more straightforward autism focus. It's basically about like a troubling trend of a lot of like people with terrorism charges or other extremist charges, like trying to play like being autistic up as some kind of like get out jail free card. Like the QAnon shaman, like his defense lawyer tried that using like incredibly ableist language to like describe the majority of Capitol rioters. The Toronto van attack from a few years ago, they also tried using that. I found out recently the Sandy Hook shooting, actually, like they also tried using that. Even there was a thing where like that one guy from back in the 2000s who tried like blowing up SUVs because he wanted to like fight like air pollution. Like they like diagnosed him with autism specifically so they could try and use that as a defense, apparently.
Yeah, it's mental illness and neurodivergence seems to come up a lot in these cases to try to distance ourselves from these terrorists and say this is not who we are, when like 9 times out of 10, if not more, they're motivated by some kind of white supremacist agenda, which is exactly who we are in colonizer nations.
Yeah, and it also just like kind of works from an assumption that people with autism don't have agency over their actions, which is bullshit. I mean, like the van attack guy, he literally went out and rented a van. And I can tell you, like, if this was really the sort of autistic person you could reasonably describe as like probably not having the most like rational control over their actions or whatever, they probably wouldn't be the sort of person whose family would just let them like rent a van, just knowing from my experiences with a lot of autistic people.
Yeah.
Like he clearly knew what he was doing. Like, see. So like yeah, there's that. There's also like another one I was actually going to do. I was actually going to do before my latest one about where I was basically gushing about Into the Spider-Verse and how I think it's better than every single MCU movie. um, where basically it's about like a very niche subject of like the flags of the far right in here in Canada, because like our far right has like several flags, including several that are very like unique to us as a nation. And flags always like say a lot about the people who are using them, and it gives like a lot of insight into like what these people are thinking and what are like the what are the different sort of like beliefs in this like general soup of very terrible people, and also what they're trying to flag towards you when they're waving these things. In fact, actually, one of the flags I'm hoping to talk about, I actually saw like for myself like last month in real life. Like I was just like walking down the street and this guy, this like some anti-masker, anti mandate person's just driving around in a car in downtown Ottawa, and has like all these slogans pasted on their car, but they also have like some flags. There's like two Canadian flags, including one that's upside down, which I don't know if that's supposed to be anything intentional, like if they're trying to do the flag is upside down to indicate like crisis thing, or if they just really fucked up like putting their flag on right side up because the other one was. But they also like hung up one that I know is very specific to like the Quebecois francophone far right, which is like ties into like a lot of colonial era history and has been like basically kind of think like the same sort of fetishization that a lot of like the American far right has with like the Patriot movement and 1776. It's like that same like kind of idea where you just steal like imagery from the past to paste it onto like you not liking the fact there's brown people living in the same neighborhood as you.
Yeah, it's well, I look forward to all that. Thank you, Radical Writer, for coming on. This has been a tremendous pleasure.
Yeah, I'm glad I could make it. It was nice getting to talk to you about this. I'm glad to see that there are people who care about my various ramblings.
Of course, have a good time of day wherever you are, everybody.
All right, bye, everybody.